The night began with the sound of silence, the kind so thick it feels like the world is holding its breath. Snow fell steadily outside, piling high against the windows, muffling even the faintest whisper of the wind. I had just finished my shift at the diner, a grueling 14 hours spent serving coffee to impatient holiday shoppers. My legs ached, and all I wanted was to collapse on the couch with a blanket and some bad TV. Instead, as I stepped into the house, I froze. Under the Christmas tree, where there had been nothing but pine needles that morning, 6 presents sat in a neat row. The sight was jarring. No one else had access to my house, and I hadn't bought or wrapped a single gift. I approached cautiously, my breath fogging in the chilly air. The heater was out again, but the cold seemed sharper near the tree, biting at my skin like a warning. The presents were wrapped in old-fashioned paper, faded and yellowed, like something pulled from a dusty attic. Each was topped with a ribbon, tied in a meticulous bow that seemed out of place in my otherwise disheveled living room. I crouched to examine the tags. They all bore the same message, scrawled in a spidery script that looked almost too delicate to be human. For you. A shiver prickled down my spine. I touched one of the boxes hesitantly, half expecting it to be icy cold or move beneath my fingers. But it was just a box. Light. Harmless. My rational mind tried to explain it away. A prank? A neighbor being overly generous? Still, no one came to mind, and the thought of a stranger in my home made my stomach churn. As I stood there, the room seemed to darken, shadows pooling in the corners. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly, each second a hammer blow in the silence. I told myself I was being ridiculous. They were just presents. But the creeping sense of wrongness wouldn't leave. The first box was small, wrapped in paper patterned with faded candy canes. I opened it slowly, the crinkle of the paper unnervingly loud. Inside was a teddy bear, its fur once brown but now a dull, dirty gray. One of its button eyes was missing, and the other hung on by a thread, giving it a grotesque, lopsided gaze. As I held the bear, an overwhelming sadness engulfed me, so strong it made my throat tighten. For a moment, the living room vanished. In its place, I saw a dim room lit by a flickering candle. A child's voice sobbed in the darkness, crying out for someone who didn't come. The bear slipped from my hands, and the vision snapped away as suddenly as it had come. The next box felt heavier, though no larger than the first. The wrapping paper crumbled in my fingers, disintegrating as if it had been left out in the rain. Inside was a porcelain doll, its face cracked in a delicate pattern that resembled frost on a window. A shiver ran through me as I touched it, the jagged edges biting into my skin. The vision this time was stronger, more vivid. I was no longer in my living room, but standing on a snow-covered road. The wind howled, and the air stung with icy needles. In the distance, I saw a girl on a sled, her laughter echoing until it turned to a scream. She raced uncontrollably toward a frozen river, the ice groaning ominously as her sled disappeared beneath it. I dropped the doll, gasping for air as the vision ended. My heart raced, and my hands trembled. These weren't just presents. They were stories, or memories, and they weren't happy ones. Each box seemed worse than the last. The third contained a small red scarf, its once bright color now darkened with soot. The moment I touched it, the scent of smoke filled my nostrils, and I was transported again, this time to a burning building. Flames roared, devouring everything in their path. A boy's face appeared at a window, his small hands pounding against the glass as smoke poured from his mouth. I wrenched myself back to reality, tears streaming down my face. My heart pounded and I struggled to catch my breath. The air felt heavier now, the shadows darker. I turned toward the remaining boxes, dread pooling in my stomach. The fourth box sat silently as if waiting for me to pick it up. And somewhere, faint but unmistakable, I heard the sound of children laughing. I didn't want to open the fourth box. The first three had already etched their horrors into my mind, their visions clinging to me like cobwebs I couldn't shake off. My hands trembled as I reached for it. A voice in my head screamed to stop, to leave the remaining gifts untouched. But curiosity, or maybe something more sinister, urged me on. The paper, this time patterned with holly leaves and berries, tore easily. Inside was a faded pair of child's shoes, scuffed and worn. The soles had holes and the laces were frayed, but they were impossibly small, no more than a toddler's. The moment I touched them, the room dissolved again. I was standing on a desolate street, the air thick with the acrid stench of rot and sewage. It was night, and rain poured in heavy sheets, pooling in the cracks of the cobblestones. A small child stumbled ahead of me, their feet bare despite the freezing cold. They were crying, their little hands clutching the empty space where the shoes had been. A shadow moved in the corner of my vision. It was large, hulking, and silent despite its size. The child froze, their sobs cutting off abruptly, and turned toward me, or rather, toward something behind me. I didn't dare follow their gaze. Instead, I screamed for the child to run, but no sound came from my mouth. The shadow reached out, impossibly long fingers curling around the child, pulling them into the darkness. I blinked and found myself back in my living room. The shoes lay in my lap, damp with what looked like muddy water. My breath came in shallow gasps, and the sound of my heartbeat thundered in my ears. "Stop," I whispered aloud, though there was no one to hear me. "Whoever you are, whatever this is, please stop." The presence didn't move, but the air around them seemed to shift, growing heavier, denser. The fifth box waited, its wrapping paper decorated with cheerful snowmen. I stared at it, willing it to disappear. But it didn't. With a shaky hand, I unwrapped it. Inside was an old photograph, its edges curled and yellowed with age. The image was black and white, but the scene was unmistakably familiar. It showed a family of 5 standing in front of a Christmas tree in what looked like my very own living room. My stomach lurched. The man in the picture was my great-grandfather, recognizable from the portraits my mother kept in the attic. Beside him stood his wife, a stoic woman I'd only seen in faded photographs. But the 3 children weren't my relatives. They weren't anyone I recognized. And yet I had seen their faces before. They were the children from the visions. A cold dread seeped into my bones as I stared at the photograph. The children looked so small, their smiles forced. Their eyes seemed to hold a plea, a silent cry for help that no one in the photo had heard. A low, guttural whisper broke the silence. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, freezing the blood in my veins. "Do you see now?" I spun around, my heart hammering, but the room was empty. The whisper came again, this time closer, almost brushing against my ear. "You must remember." I stumbled back, clutching the photograph to my chest. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of the visions and the image in my hands. My great-grandfather had lived in this house, but he was no saint. Stories about his cruelty, how he cheated poor families, stole from desperate parents, were whispered at family gatherings. They had always been dismissed as exaggerations, tales to scare children into behaving. But now, standing in the suffocating darkness of my living room, I knew the truth. He had taken more than money. He had taken lives. The photograph slipped from my hands, fluttering to the ground. I wasn't being haunted. I was being judged. The fifth box sat there, empty but accusatory, its contents now a part of the growing horror. Only one box remained, larger than the rest, its paper pristine and gleaming as if untouched by time. I didn't want to open it, but I knew I had no choice. The shadows in the room seemed to press closer, the air thick with a suffocating weight. The children's laughter echoed faintly, but now it was tinged with malice, each giggle like nails scraping against my sanity. My hands shook as I untied the ribbon. The paper fell away, revealing an old wooden chest. Its surface was carved with strange symbols, sharp lines and spirals that seemed to writhe when I looked at them too long. I hesitated, but the same guttural voice that had whispered before now growled impatiently. "Open it." I lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of letters, each one sealed with brittle red wax. I picked one up and pried it open. The handwriting inside was rushed, frantic, as though the author had written it in great fear. It was a plea for help, addressed to my great-grandfather. The writer spoke of starvation, illness, and desperation. The words begged for mercy, for charity, for anything that could save their children. I opened another letter and another. They were all the same, cries for help that had gone unanswered. And then beneath the letters, I saw it, a ledger. Flipping through its pages, my blood turned cold. Names filled every line, each one paired with a grim note. Unpaid, evicted, disposed of. I understood now. The children's lives had been stolen by my family's greed, and now their vengeance was at hand. The voice returned, louder and angrier than before. Justice for the forgotten. The lights in the room flickered and went out. The shadows surged forward, and with them came the children, silent, hollow-eyed, and pale. They surrounded me, their presence cold and unyielding. My breath hitched as they reached for me, their small hands clawing at my arms, pulling me into the darkness. Repent. Their hands were cold as death, small fingers like icy talons digging into my flesh. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. The children's faces were pale, their hollow eyes filled with fury, but beneath it, I saw their pain, the torment that time hadn't dulled. The room dissolved around me. I was no longer in my living room, but standing in a field under a blackened sky. The wind howled, carrying the distant cries of despair. Before me, the shadow from my visions loomed, its form undefined but vast, with tendrils of darkness that stretched endlessly into the void. "Do you understand now?" The voice boomed, each word a hammer striking my chest. I nodded, trembling. My voice barely rose above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." The children circled me, their mournful eyes locked onto mine. The shadow surged closer, and with it came a torrent of memories. Visions of my great-grandfather's cruelty, of doors slammed on desperate faces, of children left to starve or freeze. The images tore through me like a storm, each one a dagger of guilt. "Sorry is not enough," the voice growled. "What can I do?" I begged. "Tell me how to make this right." The shadow recoiled slightly and the children stilled. One stepped forward, a boy with sunken cheeks and a threadbare shirt. He held out the teddy bear I'd unwrapped earlier, his lips parting in a whisper that chilled me to my core. "Remember us." The other children joined in, their voices overlapping in a haunting chorus. "Tell our stories. Undo what was done. Make sure no one forgets." "I will," I promised, tears streaming down my face. "I swear I will." The air around me shifted. The shadow began to dissipate, its tendrils retreating into the void. The children lingered a moment longer, their forms fading into soft, silvery light. As they vanished, the weight on my chest lifted, leaving behind only an aching emptiness. I was back in my living room, alone. The boxes were gone, the photograph lying on the floor where I had dropped it. For a long time I sat in silence, the echoes of their voices lingering in my mind. That night I began writing. Letters, stories, anything to preserve their memories. But even now, every Christmas Eve, I feel them watching. The laughter has stopped, replaced by a quiet presence that reminds me of my promise. And I know, deep down, that if I fail, they will return.